Diversity and Multicultural Affairs. We'll call it SDMA moving forward. And I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Hello, my name is James Thomas, he, him, his, and I serve as Assistant Director in SDMA.
Thank y'all for joining us this morning. We're excited to have this dialogue with you. We're going to be talking a little bit about how to combat social justice fatigue during a marathon. And we'll explain what we mean by that in a second. But I just want to give you an overview of our conversation. We're going to start with the land acknowledgement. We'll follow that by thinking about the historical context that has precipitated some of the movements that we're currently in. And then we'll think about the connections to the contemporary movements. We'll talk about some of the goals and strategies of the opposition, because every movement has an opposition or else there wouldn't be a movement. And then we'll talk about some strategies to combat social justice fatigue, and we'll have a Q&A. So you don't have to wait until the end to ask questions. We want to encourage you to unmute yourself, to use the chat function if you feel comfortable in that sense. But you can ask questions throughout, so don't feel like you have to hold it just to the Q&A. Feel free to engage with us before then. So I want to start with the land acknowledgement and acknowledge that Loyola University Chicago currently resides on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires. This is the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, and many other tribes such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Sac, and Fox also call this area home. We want to recognize and respect their enduring relationship to this place, past, present, and future.
Okay, so we're going to jump right on in and give a little historical context on where really our marathon begins. So, you know, if you watch Golden Girls, you can start out with like picture it, but here we can say Egypt, 5000 BC. Actually, like way back, if you want to look at different religious documents, like from Moses fighting to free his people from under Ramsey, to going to Plato with the Republic, that named that man should be able to dictate what social class he belongs to, and not the Republic naming that for him. And then we even think about the Indian Wars that took place in the United States, where the indigenous folks here was pushing back against colonialism. So there was wars for approximately like 300 years, if you want to look at that. But then we also have a little thing called the Boston Tea Party, where we see protests taking place, where if we look a couple of years before, there was a Boston Massacre, so violence against the new Americans here by the British. But then, you know, it was an uproar when there was an attack on like actual property. So we might see that now in today's society. We think about abolitionist movements that took place, where even when we first started seeing the Atlantic slave trade here in the US, there were people that were there at the time that were saying, hey, I don't think this is right. Maybe we should not be treating other humans like this. And then we'll see it also when it comes to libertarianism, where there were scholars that were pushing back and saying, the movement of indigenous folks from the southeast regions of the US over to leave their land, which we call it the Trail of Tears now, was not something that we should be doing to other humans. But let's get it a little bit closer. Let's come back closer to home, where we see the women's suffrage movement pushing for voting, to we see the civil rights movement for racial equality, where we saw a lot of college students getting involved in it, to seeing the women's liberation movement. And we even go to the Poor People's Campaign that was actually headed by a lot of folks still connected with the civil rights movement that wanted to eradicate poverty in the US. And then we see Stonewall, we see trans women coming to the forefront and pushing for LGBTQIA plus rights. And then it takes us to occupational Alcatraz, where we saw indigenous folks that were pushed out of their land, and land was stolen from them. And they saw, hey, there's something here that says we can actually take any land that the US isn't occupying. And thus they were at Alcatraz for 3 years before being pushed out again. So you see here, it might take some time, you see like a little trend here of like some movements that might be continuing on, where there's a marathon of like women's suffrage to the women's liberation movement. And then that will even bring us to today. So I'm going to pass it back over to Shay with some contemporary movements.
Sorry, I was on mute. Always have to be that one, right? So James shared with you a little bit of the historical context of where we've come from, and all of those things are fused into some of the fights that are happening right now and some of the movements that are happening right now. We have folks who are having movements against prisons. So we've got prison abolition movements, this fight for 15, which is really just like people decide saying that like we need a living wage, like we need a wage, and $15 is that wage that allows us at the very bare minimum to live. We've got folks talking about educational policy and climate change, defunding some of the police activities in order to fund educational movements so that all students are gaining the same type of education. We've got the Black Lives Matter movement that's currently taking place and has been in the media for several years now. And a lot of that has been, this is the continuous fight. It's the fight that started back when folks were being owned as chattel slaves. And it's a continuous movement towards now there's not slavery, but there's mass incarceration. There is a devaluation and a dehumanization of Black lives. And we've got this movement for folks who are undocumented. So undocumented movements to shift immigration and the immigration policies of the United States, which started as a settler colonial space, but now has very strict immigration rules that essentially deny people access to this space under grounds that are really unfair. And so all of these kind of contemporary movements are in some way rooted in some of those historical movements that James was talking about earlier. But we want to know, like, what are some other movements that you've heard of that are contemporary, that you either are participating in or you've heard of? Like, what are some of those other movements? You can unmute or you can put yourself in the chat. So I did my customary Zoom 3 deep breaths to like give folks an opportunity to share. If you think of something, feel free to unmute yourself or put yourself in the chat. Something that's not up here that is deeply rooted in the work that's been done around prison abolition is restoring voting rights for people who've been convicted of certain crimes. So in Florida, the community passed a referendum that 2 years ago that said that felons who had served their time should be able to get their voting rights reinstated. And 2 years later, we still haven't seen this come to fruition because there have been roadblocks placed in by the opposition to keep people from being able to access their right to vote. Most recently, it's that you have to have paid all of your fines in order to be able to vote. And folks are like, we can't necessarily pay the fines in this particular moment. And the community is also not allowing folks to volunteer to pay people's fines because they're calling it election, like election influencing. Hanan, thank you. Said gun reform, especially with the history of school shootings in America, that's a huge one. So there have been a number of school shootings. There have been a number of shootings in America. We are the country that experiences the most mass shootings in the entire world. And much of that is just rooted in, sorry, I'm reading the chat. Much of that is just rooted in the fact that we have some nonsensical gun laws, but we also have a lack of kind of ability to enforce those things. And then there's just people who are committing acts of violence. And I think we've been desensitized to it so much in the United States that it becomes so much more commonplace. Maddie also said it's mentioned, but a continuation of the women's movement in the form of Me Too, absolutely. I think it's important for us to name that the Me Too movement was actually started by a Black woman named Tarana Burke, who's often distanced from that movement because it's been co-opted and shifted. But Me Too is also another place where we're seeing folks who are advocating for themselves, advocating for their rights, and saying this is not okay. Like what's happening right now is not okay. Thank you, Hanan and Maddie, for adding those two. Disability rights movements, like inclusive of the efforts to make current movements more accessible. Absolutely, that's another one. Yep, that's a whole nother conversation. Like, we have been able to make spaces accessible for folks because of COVID, but will we make sure that they've maintained accessibility after COVID? Like, that's a whole other conversation that we need to have. So thank y'all for sharing that. If you want to share anything else, feel free to put it in the chat. You can move to the next slide, James. I think the next, go ahead.
So the main theme of why we are having this space during these movements, we know that there comes a time where we get tired. Like if we're thinking about running a marathon, there's a moment where it's like, "Ooh, how am I going to make this to the next marker?" And this is why we're like really having this space for us to provide some tools there. So first, let's get into what is social justice fatigue. So social justice fatigue is a concept that Dr. Sarah Furr, who was actually an alum from Loyola, worked with. And here she describes it as the physical, mental, and or emotional toll incurred through advocating for social change while serving as an agent for an institution of higher education. So in this sense, within her research, she was really focused on individuals that do work similar to myself and Shay. But I argue to say that this also impacts students. I note that there are some student leaders in the space where you're a student here at the institution. You also serve in a role where you're connected to the institution as a leader. So there's an agent piece where you're having that that combat of like, I'm pushing for some change that might need to take place at the institution, but I'm also part of this school. So this is why I think this is a really good concept for us to work from. So I want to, before dive deeper into it, what are some factors that can contribute to fatigue as a student, activist, or leader? Again, feel free to use the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. Shay, feel free to read anything from the chat as I can't really see it for now. So what are some things that can contribute to you being fatigued?
Nothing in the chat just yet, James.
To speak, can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
To speak to my personal experience, I think the balance of not only balancing classes but also work on top of like the activist part of it, and in those classes often learning about the I suppose like the national and global levels of injustice, while also taking a look how it appears on campus, and coming to terms with a lot of things in that sort of educational piece that you were not aware of for the last couple of years. And it's sort of the moment of reckoning with some of the things that you're not, speaking of my personal experience, I'm not connected to in my identity. So it's a matter of like intellectualizing and learning about it.
Mm-hmm.
Maddie, you are like hitting it right on his head. Like the fact that we're at a university where you'll see microcosm of what's happening in the larger world and that impacting factor that continues to hit us. So I appreciate you really naming that. That's really key. On top of being a student in Zoom university world and working, like all these things really impact us as folks that are like leaders and activists.
Yeah,
Anyone?
Isabel added the emotional toll of consistently seeing negative news. So
Mm.
spiral of negative news that you see. And Hanan also added constantly checking the news or reading about the issues you're advocating for can contribute to fatigue.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. We're going to move forward with going a little bit deeper into this concept of social justice fatigue. So within Dr. Furr's work, she mentions the dimensions of wellness that can exist. So we see here in the center, you as an individual, this is you holding all your unique identities, the experiences you've had, different roles that you might have to come into the occupational wellness. So with you being a student that might also be an activist, there's usually so much control that you have in those areas. So for her research, she talks about these other five dimensions where we have a little more control, a little more advocacy. So there's the social, physical, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual pieces, which then talk about the environment, so the university, the world context, the things that are going on. So if we look at these, she found in her research that individuals saw that they were in lower lower impact. So they weren't really satisfied with like their social, their physical, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, where they just were feeling a blah, like kind of a blah feeling. And when it came to looking at their work, it was a struggle because their work for advocating was also tied to usually identities they held, or identities for folks they cared deeply about. So throughout this time, they took more time to reflect on how they can pour more into those different areas, which we'll talk about strategies later. So I won't take too much time talking about it, but we'll share this with y'all after. But this is like a wellness plan that she developed where folks would put more energy into areas they noted they weren't as satisfied with. And because we're intersectional beings, they found that if they poured more energy into, like, let's say, physical, and they weren't moving as much, they started doing 30 minutes a day of some form of movement. They saw an increase in these other areas, so emotional, spiritual. So like during those 30 minutes, it was like, these are my 30 minutes. So I'm taking time to even reflect and meditate for this physical piece. So we'll share this with you all. I've used this pretty regularly just to check in to see how I'm doing, and what areas I need to pour more into. And it's like you create a plan and accountability for you reaching those plans. But we'll talk more about strategies later.
So we want to talk about the opposition. And I mentioned this earlier, to name that like movements have opposition, which is why you have a movement, right? There's people who do not want whatever it is that folks are advocating for to come to pass because they don't want things to change. They have a variety of different reasons. But we are going to talk about a couple of strategies that the opposition uses to increase social justice fatigue, right? So we'll go through each of these in depth, but the overall strategies are, you can go to the next slide, James. There's an increase of fatigue and burnout, creating conflict within groups and with groups that should share similar interests, gaslighting, galvanizing supporters, dehumanizing others, and othering folks, and then desensitizing and normalizing just kind of the violence or the vitriol that's happening.
So we talked about fatigue already a little bit. So we're going to talk a little about fatigue and burnout. So here, some of the tactics that opposition might use to get you fatigue and burnout can be having a million meetings that you have to be present for. And then having unclear processes and rules that you need to figure out how to fully navigate. Going to respectability politics, where you might be getting very tired, very burnt out of having these back-to-back Zoom meetings that we have now in this world, to you just being kind of frustrated. And then where you might react, it becomes more about how you reacted and not how they originally acted. So that becomes an issue. And then there's this piece of ongoing cycles with little or no results that was like shared earlier. It's like I put in all this work and nothing is taking place. So you get to a point where you might say, you know what, I'm out. Like I need to focus on myself, so I'm just going to completely move away. And then the cycle has to start all over again. Sometimes for movements.
The next one is gaslighting. So are folks familiar with the concept of gaslighting? So we often hear about it in the terms of, thanks Maddie, I see that head nod, in the terms of like relationships. I think that's where it became most popularized as a terminology. But it's a type of emotional and psychological abuse in which the abuser manipulates information and or engages in denial in order to make the survivor question their own experience, memory, or reality. So it's a way to kind of deflect responsibility and accountability. It's a way to shift the accountability from the person who's naming that they've actually experienced harm back towards like, oh, maybe this didn't happen. And so there are different types of gaslighters, but I'm going to focus on the intellectual gaslighter because we are in a space where we're supposed to be with some folks who claim to be intellectuals. And so it can look like just hypothetically, what if, or how can we say for sure that it was racially motivated? If there was something that was racially motivated, a person might ask that. And really, it's like the devil's advocate. And so the translation when people ask you these different types of questions is basically they're saying, I'm not personally affected by X, Y, and Z. I'm just curious about it. And I am going to be charming in advancing the conversation, but I'm also going to play the devil's advocate here. So like, nah, this doesn't personally impact me. Not really sure that it's actually happening, and kind of distancing it. So it's distancing from what people are saying. So I've heard this, and like people will say, well, there's no more racism. And you'll be like, what I hear when I hear people say that is like, you aren't personally impacted by racism, so you believe it to not be a thing. That's what I hear, the translation in my mind. And a clap back to this is often to say like, people are literally dying, or racism actually really does exist, whether or not you're experiencing it or not. And I don't think that you should use this opportunity to practice an intellectual exercise. I think that's what I ask people all the time. It's like, why are you invested in advocating for the devil? Like, what do you gain from this? Do you really believe this thing, or are you just practicing an intellectual activity?
Okay. So we have inter and intergroup hostility. So this can arise when you have multiple groups. So when you see inter, that's like one group kind of working within, and there's some conflict there. Then intra is like where you have some like two or more groups where there might be some conflict. So this can arise with conflicting goals, approaches, and communication. Also the competition over at times seemingly limited resources and opportunities. So here you'll see an example where the opposition might say like, hey, what you all are doing, that's great. But you see those other folks that might be trying to push for the exact same thing you're doing. They're thugs, they're rioting, like that's negative. And that can cause some energy of putting those groups against each other, where then they could have really come together and worked against the opposition together. So these are some things. It could be saying, hey, we're going to start a task force and we have a place for one student, but then there are multiple groups that are part of this movement. How are you bringing in more than just one student voice representation? So that can start some conflict on, is the are the opposition playing favorites, and then there's some conflict there. So these are things that definitely can arise naturally with us being humans, but the opposition can really take that for their own benefit and say, okay, this might help us actually, because if they're having issues, drama can start over here. They can't put energy towards actually talking about the issue at hand. And eventually it might go back to that fatigue and that burnout where you're like, I have no time for this drama that's happening right now. So I'm just gonna peace out from it completely. And then where are we left at? We have no groups really working for the cause that was originally at hand. So these are things really to take into account for, and know that as humans, conflict will arise. And it's really about having that communication and working through those. So it's like taking care of in-house so that when things come up, we can really push and still get our goals set.
Another way that the opposition does their work is by galvanizing supporters. And so I didn't watch the debates, but I know the soundbite that came out from the president was regarding the Proud Boys, who are a far-right group who regularly spout white nationalist, anti-Muslim, and misogynistic kind of rhetoric on their social medias. And this idea of galvanizing is to just get your supporters kind of riled up and ready to actually be in opposition to what you're suggesting. So Enrique Tarrio is actually the founder of the Proud Boys. And this is a tweet that he posted very shortly after the president told them to stand by and stand down. And essentially it was like, oh, okay, we're ready. Like, we're ready for whatever it is that you tell us to do. We're ready for whatever it is that we can get away with at this point. And it's one way to just kind of, it's stroking the flames, right? Stroking this flame of, okay, well, we were recognized on national TV. Now they have a platform. Now there are folks looking at their hashtag. Now they have t-shirts that say, that have the rhetoric on there. And it's just another way to get people to get the supporters to feel riled up and ready to be in active opposition to folks who are pushing towards social change. Dehumanizing others. I think this one happens all the time. Like in order for you to, I think in order for people to really feel comfortable with opposition to certain things, they have to see people as being like less than them. Like they don't deserve the same things that I deserve. And I use another example from our current president, who early on in the COVID-19 battle called it the Chinese virus or Kung flu. Sorry, that was a typo there. But just this idea that like, oh, it is Asian identified Americans or folks who are coming here to do business, to work, who are bringing this virus. And they are the folks who did this. Like, it's not us. We don't need any responsibility for this. It came from them. They're actually the virus. And we hear this a lot in the immigration rhetoric. Around how immigrants are described, migrants are described. We hear a lot of this dehumanizing language used often there as well. The next one is desensitizing and normalizing. And I think this is the last one. And I put this meme or this screenshot here because I think this is indicative of what is kind of happening in the United States, is that right now we have a healthcare system that doesn't work for everyone. There are haves and have-nots in this system. There are folks that have access and there are folks who don't have access. And a statistic by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is that 1 in 6 Americans have past due medical care bills on their credit report. And that's $81 billion in debt. And this screenshot here was the news trying to put a feel-good story out there by saying that there was a 2-year-old who didn't have access, who didn't have the insurance access to pay for an electric wheelchair that they needed. It was $20,000. And so their local high school robotics team built this child a wheelchair. And everybody was like, oh, this is such a beautiful story. Like, we should celebrate these high schoolers. And we should celebrate these high schoolers for stepping in and stepping up in a place where there was a void. The problem is there shouldn't have been a void, and this 2-year-old child shouldn't have needed to get this robotics team to build this, because we've really become accustomed to the fact that our medical system is a dumpster fire. And so it's like, oh, let's give all of the praise to this robotics team without actually examining the cause of this issue, which is the fact that the medical system is broken. And that this 2-year-old who was insured, not even lacking insurance, but insured, couldn't get access to what they needed because of our basic kind of desensitized and normalized idea that like only certain people get access to healthcare.
So something real quick, I just want to name earlier I said intra and intergroup. I had those switched around. So intergroup is when there are 2 or more groups where there's conflict, and intra where there's one group with members having conflict. So just wanted to bounce back and name that. So now we want to kind of talk through some strategies. We have some strategies here that we'll get to in a little bit, but we want to take time for us as a community to kind of talk through what are some strategies that we can use to combat these goals and tactics that is used by the opposition. So this will kind of be a large group discussion here. You can use the chat, you can unmute and share, like based off of some of the things we shared, you yourself, what are some strategies that you have to combat this fatigue that the opposition really wants us to have?
So just as a reminder, some of the oppositional tactics that we've named are burnout, normalizing certain types of behavior, dehumanizing folks and othering, creating conflict within groups and amongst different groups, as well as gaslighting. And then some of you mentioned like reading the news constantly or seeing the cycle of bad news. So we're asking you, what are some strategies to combat some of those things? So So Hanan says, talking to a friend about how you feel or about your frustrations. Absolutely. Isabel says, talking with other people to help you recognize that you're not the only one with the fatigue. Yep. So calling on your people, naming fatigue as a thing. Those are great strategies. Anything else? Like, what are some other things that you can do?
And I love that y'all named that because it demystifies this concept of like activists are heroes, superheroes that aren't human, that experience fatigue. I feel like there's not enough conversation that's being had about like, oh, I'm tired. Are you feeling the same? It's like, no, I need to grind harder. We're in a society that glorifies the overworker. As Shay, like I love how Shay like names that. And we see that also in our activist movement. So thank y'all for naming that.
Absolutely. Another one is preparing those responses or clapbacks so you can feel prepared when people try to gaslight you or question the movements. Yes, I love a good clapback.
Yes.
I did an exercise with students at my old institution. We did a whole workshop that was just about like, we called them petty prayers. So like petty prayers and clapbacks. So an example was like, I hope that I love jollof rice, but if you've never had jollof rice, it was like, I hope that your jollof rice is not seasoned well. And that's like my petty prayer for you. So I'm not wishing you any harm. I'm just hoping that like you don't get to eat the good seasoned jollof rice, like things like that. And it was fun, but it was also a way of Robin says she loves that. It was also just a way to be like, you know what? I don't wish you any ill will. I don't have any bad intentions for you, but I also am like, you know, you shouldn't get all the nice things in life. Like, I hope you eat bland food.
I love it.
We have another person who said, echoing talking to other friends, especially on a team so other team members can step in. And especially in that advocacy when you need to step back and vice versa. Yeah, that's a great one. I always give the analogy of like a choir, and I did this in my presentation when I got hired. And the ideal is that like choirs, folks who sing in choirs, they can hold really long notes for a very long time. And that's because there are folks who are able to like stop, take a breath while other people hold the note, and then they come back in and then they have that extension of that note. And so the social justice movements are very similar to that, like this parable of the choir is that sometimes we got to take a break. We got to take a step back, and that requires other people to step forward. It requires us also to know our limitations and lean into vulnerability and not feel uncomfortable with this idea of like being fatigued, because it's real, and to be honest with ourselves and with the people around us so that we know how to support each other. Yeah, these are great. Expanding news sources to get information from/validation. That gaslighting feeling is in action. Absolutely. So a lot of people right now are just feeling really tired and gaslit by all of the news that we're experiencing across the country. And so I love this idea of like expanding your news sources so that you can know, like, actually, I am knowing this to be true, and it really is true. We are, in fact, being gaslit. I see maybe Sherrill, did you want to add something? Maybe not. I saw this person come off mute. So, all right, James, let's share some of the things that we have. So we only have two that we wanted to really focus on. That doesn't mean that there aren't others. You all have come up with a number of other ones, but we wanted to really focus on two of them because we are finding these to be things that are extremely valuable, but maybe not as talked about. And so the two are rest and community care that we're going to focus on right now. And my favorite Instagram handle, anyone who knows me knows that I love the NAP ministry. It's my favorite Instagram handle. It, like, if you're not into it, get into it. It's amazing. And what the NAP bishop has said, one of the things that she put on her Instagram is that this quote, it says, "We are not created to live in a cycle of grief and fighting. We are not created for scarcity and trauma. Please do not internalize the exhausting fight and battle constantly narrative. You can rest, and slowing down is a political protest too." And I think oftentimes that message gets missed. It's just continuous grind. Like, I got to be on this grind culture, and the rest, and as a political action, as a liberatory practice, gets lost. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like to rest, but we're also going to talk about community care. I think we have the dominant narrative is often around self-care, which is extremely important. And for social justice movements, we have to be engaged in community care as well, because it's just as valid as self-care. And so we're thinking about community care. We're talking about, you can go to the next slide, James. Essentially what community care is people leveraging their privilege to be there for one another in various ways. It's pretty straightforward. Like, I have privilege in this particular way. I can show up for people in this particular way. I don't have privilege here, somebody else does. They can show up for me or for the community in a particular type of way. And so I gave some examples here, and I'll just read one or two of them of how you can engage in pretty straightforward community care. That doesn't have to be something that is monetized. I think a lot of times when people are talking about self-care, they often talk about like, oh, you can buy this thing, you can do this thing that costs a lot of money. But in community care, it's not so much about what you buy, it's more about what you're able to do and how you are able to show up. So one of the things that you can do is like creating a group chat. And I think that we've talked a lot about folks reaching out to people, reaching out to your community, to name that, like, I need support or I need to step back, and allowing the community to hold and lift you as you take that rest, right? And so creating these group chats that reflect your needs. And then the big piece is not just creating the group chat, but using it, right? So leaning into that vulnerability around saying, I'm not okay, and it's okay that I'm not feeling okay right now, and letting people know that so that they can figure out how best to support and help you. Another thing is like not asking people to educate you about things that the internet has readily available resources for. I know, as someone who's doing this work, I'm constantly being charged with like, can you create a training about this? Can you do a workshop about this? And it's so fatiguing to, one, have access to the same Google machine and internet that everyone else does in most cases. And people are like, well, can you just do this? I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid to like give the wrong information. And it's like, you know, we all, if we're in college environments, we were taught how to check the validity of sources, how to do those things. And so it feels really lazy to me when people are just like, oh, well, can y'all do this? And I think that we have to name that there's an emotional labor of that. There's actually a physical labor of actually doing these trainings. And then delivering the information and having to do it consistently is very tiring. And so I think community care also looks like you, if you have a growth edge for yourself, figuring out how you can educate yourself about said growth edge. Another thing is like showing up for solidarity movements that don't directly impact you. So maybe you don't identify as Black, but you go to Black Lives Matter protests in solidarity. Like, there are different ways for people to be a part of movements and be in solidarity with each other. But it requires you to be really intentional. And I think that's the big piece about community care, is it requires a level of intention and action that doesn't have to be monetary, but it can be if you have that privilege to be able to donate money to particular causes or to do bailout funds, etc. And then resting. So there's an article called How to Rest and Recover While You Fight for Social Change. And they offer a variety of different steps. And I'm not going to read all of them, but we can send these out to you so that you can see the strategies that are offered here. And it's by Feminist Sex Ed. And there are things that they offer for various different ways that you're entering into the movement. So if you are feeling numb, there are strategies that they offer for that. If you're feeling alone, there are strategies that are offered for that. If you're feeling hypervigilant, there are strategies that are offered for that. And it's all, these strategies are all meant to, one, acknowledge that, like, and affirm that something is, you're experiencing something, you're experiencing a response to something, you may be triggered, you may have some kind of emotional reaction. Affirm those things as being normal. And also for us to ground ourselves in these narratives and in these notions that, guess what? it's okay for us to take a break. It's okay for us to rest. It's okay for me to feel activated by this particular type of thing and figure out what your next steps are. So we'll send you these different strategies that we've come up with, but I'll let James kind of talk about the last three a little bit, and then we will take questions.
One thing I love about these is that it's really about taking into account of where you are and like centering yourself. So like this piece about feeling overstimulated, we talk about all this news coming in, like what are some things you can do? If you're feeling hopeless, if you're like, look, this is the third meeting that I've had in 2 days and literally I keep getting the runaround. What can you utilize to help you through that? And if your heart won't stop racing, you know, that anxiety can really build up for us in these moments. Here are a couple of things you can really take part in. Here's like a beautiful closing when it comes to rest. Rest is not the enemy of change. It's one part of this fuel. I think it was Big Sean that said you got to make a pit stop to go the distance. And this is real. Like you really need to make sure you're taking time to rest in order for us to get to that point where we can continue to make this difference. So just hope that you all can really name that and not see it as a weakness. So now we want to really make an open space for like any questions about things that we've talked about or things that you're personally navigating. This is really an open space for you all. Also, if you have questions later, you would like to reach out to us, you can always email us at diversity@luc.edu, but here are our personal emails as well if you want to get in contact with us personally. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen so we can continue like the Q&A as people have them, and I can access the chat as well.
I think one question I have in regards to sort of engaging with like the counter protest side of things, you know, it's often the conversations of like at your Thanksgiving dinners or in your families and things like that. I suppose I'm wondering if I'm sure there's not a clean line that divides this, but when's the time to sort of walk away from those conversations as opposed to continue to lean into them and try to engage? Like I said, I know there's probably not a clean answer to that, but if either of you have thoughts or opinions on that, I would be interested to hear.
Me personally, I know I've had family members where I have conversations about different topics, and it depends on the person I'm talking to. So I know some family members, I feel like, okay, I know if I keep pushing a little bit, they'll eventually get to it. And then I have some family members that I know I'm talking to a brick wall and it just will not get through. And in that case, I say, okay, is my energy putting towards this individual that is not open to even hearing me worth me putting towards, or can I put the energy somewhere else, like back into myself? So then that's where I really weigh it out and will step away from that moment. Shay, if you have any suggestions as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's my relationship and my desire to really kind of have the conversation with folks. I think that's the first thing that I weigh out is like at any given moment, I'm going to enter into a space. So I'll give the context. Like my dad is super religious. He's a evangelical preacher, super religious, has very particular types of beliefs that I don't agree with. We have different beliefs. But there are topics that I've seen him move on. He's also a police officer, right? So we have two intersecting identities that are currently, he feels like, are under attack. But I recently was home and we had this conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement. And he kept being like, well, you know, I don't think people should be destroying property and blah, 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 blah. And I stopped for a second and I was like, okay, do I want to have this conversation with him, or do I feel like he's even open to hearing it? And so I just asked him, I said, you know, how are you entering into this space? Like, do you feel like I'm in opposition to you right now? Because if so, I know this isn't going to go well, right? But he was like, no, I just feel like I want to have a conversation. I want to understand. And I was like, okay, really and truly? And he said, yes. So we sat for about 3 hours, and I never went into this conversation with the assumption that we would come to the same understanding. I just wanted him to hear me. I wanted him to hear me, and that was it, because just by hearing me, at some point, it might pique his mind to think about something differently. And we talked about, like, he wasn't thinking about things from a historical context. He was just thinking about the contemporary movement. He was like, this is what it is right now. And I had to break it down to him. I was like, we're talking about slavery, we're talking about genocide, we're talking about this, that, and the other. And he was like, I hadn't thought about that. We still didn't end up agreeing like that. We didn't come to some kind of consensus. But what I left that conversation feeling like is that he wasn't going to be out here spewing some ridiculous rhetoric about people who are out here making movements for their lives, right? He's not going to a protest. But I felt like he heard me enough to be able to, at the very least, change his mind about why people are protesting. And so I think you have to think about what your relationship is to this person, what you desire to come out of the engagements with them. And there's an article that I used to send around to folks, is like how to talk to your family about a Donald Trump presidency and like not flip the Thanksgiving table over. So I'll look forward to see if I can find it to share with y'all in the aftermath of this, because it had some really good tips about how to do your own emotional regulation to make sure that you're not in a place where you're hyperactivated, which then makes it hard for you all to have a conversation.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one more question. Well, if not, I think I'll turn it over to Robin to close us out and let folks know what is happening next.
Thank you so much, Shay and James. This is really wonderful. I know that I learned a lot as well. I appreciate your time. So this was recorded, so this presentation will be available. So if y'all want to rewatch it, or if you want to send it to your friends or your family members or anyone out there that is a possibility for you, I will stick around for a couple more minutes if anyone has any questions about the Wellness Center or the Wellness Fair at all. But James and Shay, I want to thank you both so much for your time. This was really wonderful. And thank you all so much for coming to an early morning session. I appreciate y'all.
Yeah, thank y'all.
All right, see y'all. Thank you.
We can stick around for a few more minutes too, just in case any other questions come up for folks.
Perfect. Yeah, we've got 2 more minutes before I gotta hop on another call.
Shay, I just wanted to offer like a late welcome to Loyola. I know you joined, I think, back in July. And James, I know we've worked together briefly before, but I'm with the student government, so I know you work with Taylor and things like that. But wanted to offer a late welcome, introduce myself. But appreciate the time this morning, appreciate the session, and appreciate the Wellness Center as well for organizing this whole day. So thank you all.
Thanks, Maddie. Much
Maddie.
appreciated.
Thanks for coming, Maddie.
Have a great rest of your days.
You too.
All right, I'm gonna stop the recording.